have a twofer this afternoon. Two gentlemen from the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. You're going to hear a lot about what they're doing here with transportation research. First is Allan Rutter, who's going to talk about the Highway Rail Grade Crossing State Action Plan, the SAP model. And TTI's worked with the Federal Highway folks and the FRA to complete this plan that Allan's going to talk about. Allan has more than 30 years experience working in the public sector. You may remember him from the North Texas Tollway or as a former FRA administrator. And then we're going to have Curtis Morgan, Associate Research Scientist and Program Manager of the Multimodal Freight Transportation Program at Texas A&M Transportation Institute, which we're now going to just call TTI because everybody knows where we're at. And Curtis is going to discuss the guidebook for intercity passenger rail planning and development. And TTI had led a national team in development of the TRB, the Transportation Research Board's National Cooperative Rail Research Program on this, and how to run a intercity passenger rail network, how to plan for it, and how to implement it. So with that, we're going to bring up Allan Rutter first. So please give these gentlemen a round of applause for hanging in here with us.
Thank you very much. So I have two jobs here. One is information transmission. Two is NAP prevention. So I'll try to keep this brisk. And for those of the folks who have to go catch connection flights, that's perfectly okay. I will not take that personally. Thankfully, the fact that I get to talk about what I do to anybody who's actually interested in what I do, which is a very different thing from at home, where my family is very pleased that I'm employed, but that doesn't mean they want to know what I do. So, yeah, exactly. They're happy the money comes in, but that's about it. So I'm going to talk to you about a project we've done and some application of that having to do with highway grade crossing safety, state action plans. Part of what we're going to do is why do you have to do one? How did it happen that people thought that it needed to be done and then got to the point where it had to be done? Second is, what does it look like? What does a state action plan mean? What's the context? And then finally, what's Texas doing about it? We're helping TxDOT get ready to update its overall state action plan. So those are the three things I'm going to do with you guys. So first, why a state action plan? What happened that created the need for that? So I'll talk a little bit about timelines here. Way back in 2004, the Office of Inspector General with the USDOT, which is kind of a performance management organization within USDOT, they started looking at grade crossing crash statistics and fatalities and started saying, we understand the whole thing about Section 130 and how you prioritize which grade crossings to put protection devices, but we're looking at these crashes and they keep seeming to happen in the same places even if you put grade crossing protection devices there. Maybe you guys ought to think about how to think about grade crossing safety, not just about which is the next place to put a protection device. So one of the things that happened is Louisiana and Texas both sort of volunteered, let's think about what that looks like, and creating the sort of first state action plans for that. Having done so, and based on the Inspector General's report on this, the Rail Safety Improvement Act and PREA back in 2008, which created the whole high-speed rail program and a whole lot of, and the PTC mandate, also required for the 10 states with the highest number of grade crossing fatalities, they got the privilege of doing a state action plan. Texas is included in that. We have more rail miles, more crossings, more fatalities. We're number one, the foam finger. Texas was one of the states that did that, and there was a reason for that. One of the things that Congress said was the FRA and FHWA should put in some guidelines on what a state action plan for those 10 states looked like. So by 2010, they had gotten around to telling states, here's what we expect and here's what you guys get to go do. Within a year, there's a crash that happens in Merriam, Nevada, kind of out in the middle of nowhere on a U.S. highway that connects to one of the interstates, where a truck actually hit the side of an Amtrak train that was moving through the grade crossing, hit into it. And so the NTSB kind of looked at the reasons why, what had been done at that grade crossing, what were some of the circumstances. And as the NTSB is like to do, they said, all things considered, there ought to be more state action plans, and frankly, everybody ought to do one, even if it's not required. So the FHWA responded to that in two ways. One, they created a need for coming up with a model state action plan guidance, which one of the things that TTI got to put together on their behalf. And they issued, jointly with the FRA, some guidance on what a state action plan ought to look like. That happens early in 2015. Later that year, the FAST Act, the latest surface transportation reauthorization happens, and Congress, the same guys who came up with the idea of having 10 states do a state action plan, they decided everybody gets to do a state action plan. And so having had the report itself, which has model state action plan guidance, that's pretty much what every state is looking at doing for the next round. So the relationship of a state action plan to the normal practice of prioritization and grade crossing protection under the Section 130 program is kind of analogous to long-range planning in a bigger context and how that relates to the annual project planning that any Department of Transportation or an MPO does. It looks at a bigger picture, what's happening with grade crossing protection, what's happening with grade crossing stats and fatalities, and how does that affect the kinds of projects you're going to want to do. So let's talk about how one of these things gets done and what's involved. The environment for how to consider one of these state action plans is there's both internal and external stakeholders and engagement. One of the things that one of these plans needs to do is fit within the other planning exercises that any state DOT is responsible for. When Mark and Werner was talking about the state rail plan that they're doing, one of the things this has to do is be consistent with the rail plan. Section 130 highway is part of the Highway Safety Improvement Program. One of the things that their TxDOT and other DOTs are responsible for reporting to the FHWA on. So there's an awful lot of things about how this kind of program fits within the other things DOTs do. And then there's also a whole bunch of other external stakeholders, the railroads themselves, Operation Lifesaver, the private nonprofit group that's interested in and has volunteers that talk about improving grade crossing safety. And then some of the other federal agencies, the FRA and the FHWA at the division level. And then some law enforcement and first responders. And we'll talk a little bit about how law enforcement gets involved in this as well. So one of the things we did in our product was come up with an outline of what's involved in that bigger picture action plan. And it includes not only getting a picture of what's going on with crashes and what you're doing with those state Section 130 dollars, but what's leading to some of the crash outcomes and what can you do in terms of data analysis. And then once you've identified what your highest priority needs are, you identify here's how we're going to do something about that. And some of it has to do with grade crossing protection and some of it has to do with other safety improvements. And ultimately, it's an ongoing exercise to try to put some bigger picture context for how you improve overall grade crossing safety. So what's TxDOT doing about this? One of the things that we had done as part of putting that state action plan model for the FHWA is we looked at a bunch of other states in terms of noteworthy practices for what people were doing with their grade crossing protection. And one of the things we noticed, Paul Worley is here from North Carolina. North Carolina DOT was doing some really interesting things about data analysis. And one of the things that's here is whenever you have a grade crossing crash, there's actually two crash reports that get reported. One has to do with the railroad, and that gets reported to the FRA, and that's part of the FRA's inventory. But also what happens is the law enforcement on the highway side creates a crash report on the traffic side. And so there are two separate entities that talk about what that crash was. And one of the things that North Carolina had done was say, we ought to be able to figure out, match those two reports and get a better sense of what's going on at that crash location. So one of the things that we are going to be doing for TxDOT is taking advantage of TxDOT's crash records information system and taking the geolocation of that crash report and the geolocation that comes from the FRA, matching them together. Because one of the things that happens is the FRA inventory crash report has a bunch of railroad-related things, but the crash records report has all kinds of stuff about the driver, the conditions of the roadway, time of day, impaired or not. And so we're able to do a lot richer statistical analysis on causal factors which led to why that crash happened. And then what can you do to keep that crash from happening? And some of that may have to do with protection devices and changing some of those conditions, but there also may be some things that happen on the roadway itself that you could do some additional signing, more protection, making it more visible that a crossing is coming up. Try to get that driver's attention to realize that the train coming through, I mean, how in the world you drive a truck into the side of a train? I don't understand that. But what you can do to make sure that people don't make that bad choice. So one of the things that we'll be doing is taking advantage of that statistical analysis that then informs the next round of that state action plan. The first time TxDOT did that, one of the things they realized at doing the data dive is that a lot of their crashes were happening where there were grade crossings right next to intersections, and the need for the intersection and the traffic control lights to be interconnected and there to be some sort of preemption. Not everybody was paying attention to how that worked and making sure that those two things communicated to each other really effectively. So one of the things TxDOT did in its first action plan was pay a lot of attention to that preemption and make a really big difference on the overall incidence and frequency of those crashes. So we'll be taking advantage of some of that statistical analysis. The other thing we'll be doing is taking advantage of Google Earth and some of the satellite imagery to update the physical inventory to make sure that what the FRA says is on the ground is actually on the ground. That way we can tell some statistical analysis about roadway condition, how many lanes, what kind of signage they have, what kind of markings are available. And so one of the things we'll be doing is making sure that all of this work is consistent with the state rail plan update that's happening, and we're communicating with both the TxDOT folks and their consultant doing that rail plan, matching those planning and outcomes to the data, and then making sure that we take advantage of our analysis and understanding of global trends in crashes, frequency, how things are happening, and making sure that we can make a constructive difference and making a difference for outcomes to make sure that people in Texas continue to increase the amount of safety that happens as people and railroads interact with each other. That's pretty much my shtick. You guys did a very good job of staying awake. I very much appreciate it. That probably has something to do with the caffeine that you consumed during lunch. So I'll take credit for that. And now we'll have Curtis talk to you about passenger rail planning, and then at the conclusion, the two of us can take your questions. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit, as my presentation is up here, but I'm going to talk about National Cooperative Rail Research Program. That's the first thing that we'll talk about. National Cooperative Rail Research Program. Report 6 is the one that we worked on, and it's basically intercity passenger rail planning and development guidebook. As Peter said, I'm also at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. A little bit about the NCRRP to start with. The National Cooperative Rail Research Program was created by the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act back in 2008. It really didn't get started until about 2012, 2013, and by the time they got around to our project, it's like 2013, I think, when we started working on it. So it was towards the tail end of when the PRRIA was actually in effect. But it's administered by the Transportation Research Board, which you may have heard about in some other presentations. But basically, they asked us to go out and look and produce a guidebook that would describe what is the process, what are the things that work and don't work, who are the parties that need to be involved in looking at development of intercity passenger rail service. Again, the distinction being intercity, not local transit, but intercity passenger rail service. So they wanted us to conduct a comprehensive review of everything that was out there, reports that existed, what certain states were doing, what things needed to be done, everything about planning, identify the user needs, where are the places where there's gaps, where were there not things that were documented that needed to be known. And then when we found those gaps, they wanted us to conduct what they called targeted syntheses, basically where we went out and did a deep dive into looking at where improvement could be made in those areas to document what you need to do and what you need to be thinking about. And then finally, easier said than done, generate a comprehensive user-friendly guide on that. So to do this project, it wasn't TTI alone in this. We went out and we formed what I think is one of the really good teams, and we were able to produce a better document for the TRB by teaming with several very good partners. First was David Simpson Consultants. He was the chair of the Transportation Research Board Intercity Passenger Rail Committee at that time. Second was ESH Consult, Bruce Horwitz, who happens to be here today in the back of the room. Both those are very instrumental persons in working on the report. Bruce is the chairman emeritus of that. Walter Zulig was a lawyer based in New York City. He looked at some of the legal aspects that were associated with this type of work. And Ohio University, finally, Dr. Ben Sperry, who used to work for us at TTI before he moved on to work as a professor at Ohio University. So some of the things that were ongoing while we were working on the project, I described it in previous presentations about this. It's kind of like working on a car while you're driving down the roadway. Things were always changing, things were always happening, different things were taking place. As I said earlier, the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act expired during the middle of the project, and so in 2014, through 2014 and then into 2015, a replacement for it. And that acronym PRRIA stands for Passenger Rail Reform and Investment Act was passed. And so it had some different aspects to it. And then finally, as we were finishing up the work, the FAST Act was passed as it was being finalized. There were other STB and other oversight changes. There were a lot of other NCRRP projects going on at the same time. We'll come back at the end of the presentation and talk about some of those that cover different aspects. So we didn't want to repeat or step on what those other projects were doing. We also realized very early on that a guidebook on how to do intercity passenger rail couldn't be one size fits all. For one reason, the large part of our audience for this were going to be state DOTs. Allan mentioned Paul Worley. North Carolina DOT already had a program that was up and running. They were running trains in partnership with Amtrak on state-owned track that also had freight rail that's operating on it, but as a working with the state who owned the track. Other states have localities would have a very different situation where it's privately owned rail, and you're going to try to approach them and talk to them. So we wanted to talk to all these people, and we did as part of the interview process for this project. So finally, the format we decided to do as we produced the report was really look at it and say, what do states or local and regional planners need to know, and what do they need to be thinking about as they consider an intercity passenger rail project? So the report covers project and program development all the way from original vision to operations phase, and we'll get to more detail in the subsequent slides. But it describes the existing intercity passenger rail environment, all the regulations that were current at the time the report came out. There have since been some new things that have come out, but it's a good primer for people who are trying to get a lay of the land. How do these things work? Past experience that people have had in this area. We interviewed people, and they're listed there on the slide, public and private operators, state DOTs, private railroad representatives. And then we came up with 5 of those targeted syntheses that covered the gap areas. If you look here at the outline overview, we kind of broke it down into 5 different phases of any type of intercity passenger rail project. First being the visioning, where we looked at just what is going on out there and looked at how do you establish a program at the state level. Second, in the planning phase, what kind of things do you have to go through as far as planning your service and operations, feasibility studies, and then finally, environmental. We looked at that. Design and construction, just covered exactly what it says. And then operations phase. You go into ongoing service operation and ongoing service management. We broke it into two things. And then the appendices had the targeted syntheses. So a little bit more detail on those. The introduction, why do you even want to consider intercity passenger rail development in the first place? We go into a little bit of who are the guidebook users, who are the people that are going to be looking at this, and what might you get out of it. Intercity passenger rail service development process. What are the processes that are in place about setting this up? As far as visioning, intercity passenger rail program establishment, we looked at different states. How do different states have their programs set up, and how are they maintained? How are they funded? What are the administrative and institutional options? Is it run inside the DOT, outside the DOT, in a separate agency? And again, we had to cover as many bases as we could because a lot of states handle it in different ways. We wanted to basically lay out those options rather than be prescriptive of what someone in any state needs to do. We have here the Texas Rail Plan, picture of that, the previous one, not the one that's being worked on now, and I'll put another hit in to get your comments in for the 2019 Texas Rail Plan. But we also looked a little bit at funding of intercity passenger rail programs. What are other states, how had they funded their rail programs? There was a completely different NCRRP report on that, NCRRP Report 1, which went into much greater detail, but we tried to give the basics of what was included there. On the next slide, we show what we went into next, project feasibility and service development. What are the design and route selection options? How do you coordinate with private railroads and other state and federal agencies? What are involved in service development planning? What kind of feasibility studies need to take place? How much would one of those cost? We tried to answer a lot of those questions based on studies that had taken place previously. In Chapter 4, we set aside for the environmental requirements. You've heard a lot about that today, EIS and other processes that are having to take place. We talked about those and how long they take, what kind of regulations there were, how do you do one with EPA and FRA, how do they match up? What are the requirements of each of those? For chapters 5 and 6, we get more into the design and construction and the operations and maintenance. We really tried to look at all the issues that we could. They're listed there on the slide. Looking at passenger rail stations, grade crossings, rolling stock, what are the options that you have there? What kind of things can you look at? How do you better manage the construction activities? For chapter 6, we went into more service planning. Do you do it yourself? Do you operate it at the state level, or do you contract out to do it? Do you work with Amtrak? We looked at risk management and resiliency planning. What are the kind of costs that are associated with different types of operations? We looked at maintenance of way and maintenance of equipment as well. Chapter 7, once you're up and running, have it built and operating, there are a lot of questions about your fares. How are you going to charge people? How do you keep track of that? How do you manage the revenues that you take in? Where does that go? And in the context of a state government, how does that fit? For marketing and outreach, you talked a lot about, do you do that internally with staff, or do you go out with a consultant to do that? So at that point, now that you're up and running, do you, how and when do you look at expansion? And then finally, legal risk and operating multiple. If you have more than one, how do they operate? Can they cross-subsidize with one another? Finally, the appendices or the target syntheses. These are really more than going out and looking and documenting what other people have done or options that you could have. These were where we found the gaps, and we went out and we looked at new research that would document what needs to be, I've said and document a lot, I realize, but we're really just trying to get it all into this guidebook so that people can have it there as a reference. We looked at 5 different areas: liability and insurance requirements for intercity passenger rail service. This is one of the big barriers to entry. We looked at the PRIA had a section 209, and it had cost formula transparency. This is how Amtrak and the states work together to pay for service throughout the United States. And I think that's the one that Bruce led. He's had a long experience with Amtrak funding, and he led the development of that. We looked at robust intercity passenger rail service delivery. How do you do something that's resilient and going to serve people instead of just the minimum to get by? We looked at performance measurement and quality assurance techniques that are in operation throughout the U.S. And finally, the role of the Surface Transportation Board regarding intercity passenger rail service. When the final report came out, they did put one more appendices in there beyond that, which was our final report, and has the information from the survey that we did, a lot of the input, the interviews, and we tried to make those interviews where they'll be accessible to people without specifically identifying who may have given certain answers. I'll finish on this list of other NCRRP reports that we were working in the context of. Different ones on alternate funding and financing, the difference between those, building and retaining workforce capacity, comparing energy consumption of passenger rail with other intercity modes, looking at passenger rail in the context of dynamic travel markets, and then finally looking at developing multi-state institutions. And I think Allan was on the board for the study that did that. He wasn't working on the project, but he was on the oversight committee for that one. There's also, for NCRRP, there's some additional reports that are online only, including an inventory of all the state passenger rail programs throughout the United States, and those are accessible on the website of the NCRRP. With that, I will again give you the link to where those NCRRP projects are discussed. I will say that the NCRRP has not been funded since that original act expired, and so this is something that we hope that in the future could be revived, basically as a program, so that additional research in the rail area at the national level could be done. And then with that, we'll invite Allan back up for questions.
Still awake, that's good.
Barely. That was my report, by the way, so I guess.
Good presentation, both of you. Allan, on these crossing safety action plans, I think what we're going to see is a lot of states doing them, and when you do that, they have a tendency to become cookie cutter. They fulfill a certain role and they go on a shelf. What are things that we can do as a community, as practitioners on these studies to make them different and useful, and stay in and be a guidebook that stays on the corner of somebody's desk or a file on their desktop in advocating for the success of the crossing safety program? That's my first question. And then my second one is talk a little bit about lessons learned so far in your process.
Okay, so the first question is, how do we make sure that these action plans actually have a life of their own and actually aren't just something you do because the feds tell you have to do? I think one of the things that we're likely to find as more states do these is that, one, the results are going to be state specific. It isn't going to be the same in every state. I mean, Texas's is going to be we're unique. There you go. But a lot of it has to do with just how many crossings we have, how the scale of the rail network in our state, and the fact that so many of those crossings happen where I think one of the things that we might find through the data analysis is some things that I know some of the railroads have been suggesting through their own statistical analysis, is there may be some lower cost improvements on the roadway side Each, a pretty extensive grade protection device can be anywhere from $250,000 to $400,000. That's a lot of money. You may be able to do some roadway improvements, markings, paint, signage, communicating with the driver that may have as much to do with outcomes at a much lower cost. So that may have some ability to spread your Section 130 allotments a lot farther with a lot better outcomes. And so I think the proof in making these work is how states apply them. There's a real incentive to make that difference. One, because I think there's an interest in making sure that the Section 130 program continues to be a direct set-aside. Every time you have a reauthorization, there's a temptation on the part of some of the highway guys to say, we told them to do that. If we want to, we'll, don't tell us what to do. That hasn't happened. As a matter of fact, progressive legislation has increased the amount of money that's in that set-aside. But I think the action plans are a good way of encouraging states to pay attention to fatality crashes and make a difference. That's one of the good things about the Section 130 program is it's about how, it's a very measurable thing, and it's a consequential thing because it's about people's lives and families and how many people are affected by it. And so I've beat that one to death. The second question was? Lessons learned. So part of that is going to be as we see this next round of post plans coming into place. I think one of the things that we did in putting the model state plan together was look at some noteworthy practices of what other states have been doing. One of the things that TxDOT does that not a lot of other states either have the ability to do or have had the capacity to do is while they get money from the federal set-aside, they also match that with a lot of state money. The Grade Crossing Protection Program in Texas is a lot larger than a lot of states because the Transportation Commission, as part of their safety program, invests extra money into it. I think one of the other things that will be kind of interesting to watch is how grade crossing safety is affected by changes in both rail service patterns. One of the things that particularly the North Dakota guys, while the Bakken Shale was happening, was experiencing some different kind of crash outcomes, and we're working in Texas about how grade crossings in the Permian Basin are also affected. So I think there's going to be some interesting applications that are, again, unique to each state that they're working on. Thanks. And thanks to Drew and others in NCDOT for helping us out with that. Other questions? We love returning people's time. Thanks. Thanks for paying attention.